Please turn your attention to our town hall moderator, NRCDV's Director of Racial Equity,
Director de Equidad Racial y Cambio Social, Jacqueline Miller, que va a
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Lolita. It is great to be with everyone on
estar
day.
aquí en el día 2.
Tara
Tara está
Es una experta reconocida de violencia en contra de la mujer.
Executive and administrative leadership
y es
of the YWCA
del YWCA, Glendale y Pasadena, California.
eliminate racism and empower women. Tara has played a pivotal role in revitalizing the agency's 95-year legacy of supporting local women and girls by expanding programs and reach and igniting
Y prender o iniciar un cambio, una conversación alrededor
racial equity in Glendale and surrounding communities. Tara co-founded and leads the Coalition for an Anti-Racist Glendale, which helped draft the city of Glendale's historic Sundown Town resolution, apologizing for its racially exclusionary history as a sundown town. Tara brings more than 20 years of experience addressing domestic violence, youth violence, sexual assault, and reproductive rights. And also, Zoe Flowers is an author, content creator, healing practitioner whose work can be found in several anthologies, journals, and interviews. In 2004, Zoe interviewed survivors of domestic and sexual violence. From Ashes to Angels' Dust, A Journey Through Womanhood is the book that emerged from those interviews. Since then, Zoe's conducted listening sessions with survivors of violence
de
across
violencia a través de Florida,
tribal elders in Canada about missing and murdered Indigenous women, Black students at the University of Florida and Florida A&M University about the university's response to them during COVID-19, and Black Lives Movement, community members and advocates in the US, London, and Canada about sexual assault and Uber ride share service, and advocates and executive directors across the US and territories about racial inequity in the gender-based violence movement. Will you join me in welcoming Tara and Zoe? Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you so much. So Tara and I wanted to start with a grounding. So I want to just invite you all to take everything out of your hands. If you have anything in your hands, unless you're driving. If you're driving, don't do this. And just go ahead and let your shoulders drop. Your hands can be up or down on your thighs. If you feel like you need a little bit more rooting right now, you can just place your hands face down on your thighs. And we invite you to just take a deep breath in, exhaling out, taking another deep breath in and just giving yourself a thank you, an acknowledgement for showing up anyway. In the midst of all the other things that we have going on, we continue to show up. So just wanted to give us acknowledgement for that. And I'm going to turn it over to Tara. Go ahead and open your eyes. Can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. Sorry. Thank you, Zoe, so much for that grounding. And my name is Tara Peterson. I am the CEO of the YWCA Glendale and Pasadena. And it is an honor to be here in community with you all. And I feel extremely honored to be joining Zoe Flowers as part of this presentation and conversation that we're going to have. Both Zoe and I have worked in the movement for over 20 years in a variety of capacities at the national, state, and local level. And today we both continue to do the work in different ways, but we are still here in this movement and have been on this journey, parallel journey together for a very long time. And so we're going to reflect back on our journey, share some of the work that we did together in California around prevention, and also begin to share some of the work that we're now doing through the lens of racial justice and anti-racism. So with that, we'll get the conversation started. And we'll start about talking with you, Zoe, about what inspired you, what inspired your journey into this movement. Mute, you're on mute, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I did just launch into the grounding. So I just want to give my pronouns. They are she and her. And I am calling in from Hartford, Connecticut. And so this is the original land of the Podunk, the Bequanet, the Narragansett, and many named and other unnamed tribal communities. And you may see an errant cat. I just want to warn you, if you see a tail, I'm trying to like keep him out of the place, but he's wanting my attention today. Probably just because I'm doing this. So I came into the work as a survivor who didn't know I was a survivor. I just thought that I had dated a person who had anger issues, somebody that I could help with their anger, somebody that I could make, you know, if I showed them love, I thought that they would be loving back. That did not happen. And I basically just added, I answered an ad in the newspaper. So that tells you how long ago that was, for an office manager position at a coalition, and came to the coalition and started reading everything there was and realized that, whoa, there's a name for what I went through, and so many other people went through it, and there's all these people working on it. And yeah, and that's when I was able to put a name to what I'd been through, and that kind of changed everything. What about you?
So I came into this work when I was listening to Renee early talk, and when she got into the 2000s, it all sounded very familiar because that was the time I was introduced to the work. And I was starting in a space working with pregnant and parenting teens. And as I was working with these young girls, mostly girls of color, mostly girls that live in poor communities with limited access to health and education, and as I started having conversations with them, there was one common theme with many of these girls, and that they were either experiencing some form of violence in their life from their boyfriends or family members, or they grew up witnessing their own mom as children of domestic violence. And so as I was doing this work and we were thinking about preventing teen dating violence, I remember feeling a disconnect of how can we talk about preventing teen pregnancy if we're not talking about preventing the violence against women and children. And I found an ad in the paper similar to an organization that was hiring a shelter hotline worker. And that's the ad I answered. I was brought in for an interview and was immediately asked if I would rather take the position of the African American outreach counselor. That was the kind of the thing in the late 2000s. There were titles that were very tokenized, but I was so naive, I didn't realize that, right? So as a young African American woman who just graduated, who had her master's degree, I also recognized that I was coming from a place of privilege. So I really felt honored to have that title. I was like, yes, I want to be, I identify as a Black woman. I want that in my title. How cool is that? But then I quickly realized as I accepted the job, because I couldn't find anyone else, right? That I was faced with barriers of how am I going to do this work if I'm expected to bring women of color together, which was my role, to support them, provide support group. But I was given this curriculum that I was like, if I bring this curriculum into the support group with these women of color, these Black women, they're not going for it. And it was just, you want me to take the curriculum that you use for all of your other mainstream groups, but present it in this group of women of color because I'm a woman of color. And so therefore you think it translates. And so I felt that immediately and had to really think of different strategies and ways to really create a safe space for the African-American women that I was working with at that time. And luckily enough, I think when you talk about taking risks, you know, because it was an African-American women's support group and I was the only Black woman at the organization, it was closed to only Black women. So I was able to do whatever I wanted to do in that group. There was no supervisor was going to come in and observe me. I said, forget this curriculum. And the book that we really focused on is Change, 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 which is, I know everybody who came into this movement as a Black woman in that early 2000s are aware of that book. And we just basically went through, that was our curriculum. That was our Bible. And that's how I was introduced into this work.
Wow. I love that. Yeah. Change.
So I want to talk about how we came together because we kind of both came in this movement. And one thing that I've always felt like in this work is I've always felt supported in this work. I had Black women who were mentors for me. I also know that as a woman of color, as a biracial woman of color, there is privilege that comes with that. In the way that I look. And I also know there's this privilege that comes with that. But I've been really privileged and fortunate to be able to do this work. And when I began my prevention work, I was at the state coalition, which is also privileged, right? You get access to a lot of information and resources. So when I reflect back on the work that we took, our early prevention work, I'm curious around your journey as coming into California as a darker skinned sister, coming to work for me, which I was so grateful for. What was your journey like in doing prevention work early on in California? How did that work look to you?
Yeah, it was really, I think we did really good work. I talk about a lot of that early work that we did quite a bit. Now moving from Atlanta to Sacramento, yes, it was a little bit of a culture shock. But the idea of prevention really resonated with me. I didn't know about prevention. I was, firmly entrenched in intervention work at that time. But when that, position as the Delta coordinator came about at the partnership, what really resonated with me was the opportunity to talk about the world that we wanted to see. That was the thing that really jumped out at me about prevention at that time. It was very clear, and there was even language about sort of, we are creating the world that we want to see. And that is how I have lived my whole life. So, there were many positions at the coalition at that time. And when I saw that one, I was like, this is me. This is the one I want. And so there was a lot of freedom because it was kind of the beginning. I don't think there was a Delta coordinator, or maybe there was. No, I was the first one, right? I can't. Listen, 20 years ago, I can't remember everything. So there was a lot of freedom in what we were able to do within the partnership. But at the same time, with it being, a CDC project, there were a lot of restrictions and things like that coming down from the top. So a lot of the work that I did at that time was working with our 6 local programs that were doing the prevention strategies in their towns and cities, And I also did a lot of translating, like taking the ideas that they had as local programs and really helping them translate it into something that, you know, the CDC wouldn't send back, wouldn't have a lot of questions on. And really, I did a lot of helping them to put language to what they were doing, because I don't think that we got a lot of that coming into the work. A lot of times just coming into the work, even at the coalition level, as I, you know, my first coalition, it was kind of just like, welcome to the work. Here's the file, you know, of all the 6 people who came before you. Good luck figuring it out, right? But I think at the same time, we did have the benefit of a lot of conferences. We had a lot of meetings. We had a lot of conversations. That was kind of how you and I met, was at a conference. So there was opportunities for learning at the coalition level if you wanted it, not so much at the local programs. And so I tried to do a lot of, again, translating their ideas into this sort of higher level language. I also did a lot of traveling around the state talking about prevention. There was a lot of resistance from programs about, you know, is this prevention money going to interrupt the intervention strategies and the intervention works and the shelter work? There was a lot of that. And so we had a lot of calls with people, really training them on how intervention and prevention actually work together. Because one of the things we knew was once we started talking about prevention, hotline calls went up, right? Shelter stays went up. So it was really important for folks to really understand how the two things could work together. There was also a lot of focus on collaboration, again, to get these very high level, you know, language. Again, I didn't come from prevention. I loved the public health model. I loved the social ecological model, but the prevention principles, you know, getting to outcomes, all that evaluation stuff that Tara was like great at, that I definitely struggled with that. So I was learning along with the local programs how to put our own flavor on, again, these high level conversations that the CDC was having. And one of the other things we did, so we were charged with starting a statewide consortium. So I got to work with what was then CalCASA, which is now Valor. We worked very closely with them to build a prevention consortium across the state. We had a lot of meetings. We did regional meetings with the local Delta programs, myself and our empowerment evaluator at the time. Just again, bringing people together, bringing the local programs together so they could talk about what was working with their programs, what wasn't working. We were also doing that on the national level. The national deltas were yes. Oh, hey, David. Yes, we did some good stuff. So there was a lot of things happening also at the national level. The CDC would fly us all to Atlanta, and all of the national coordinators, we would get together and talk about the struggles that we were having and how to get through all of the reporting and like all of those things. So at every level, there was opportunities for built-in support. And so that's what we were doing. And then of course, introducing primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. We were doing a lot of that at that time too.
Absolutely. So even when you think about that model and that framework of the Delta Project, it's from this operating from this place of privilege and having access, right? And we were part of the mainstream movement as women of color, and so we really were able to benefit from that privilege. But at the same time, because we were women of color, we were also able to navigate and implement the program through our lens as women of color. And so that's one of the things that I've always taken away. I got introduced to prevention work as one of the original 14 states funded by CDC for the Delta Project. And I remember at that time really struggling with the language and the framing, specifically around primary prevention. And at that time, we weren't really discussing racial justice or anti-racism work. And I remember thinking, like, how can we take this work into communities of color if they've already experienced so much trauma, so much racial trauma from just being underserved, poverty? how can we actually translate this work into communities of color and actually really truly do primary prevention work when the trauma is already there. So I remember really struggling with that language, but I was in love with the idea of how can we prevent it before it starts, right? So that was like, for me, like, wouldn't it be a beautiful world if no one had to be exposed to domestic violence, right? If children did not have to witness domestic violence. And so those are the things that really resonated for me. And how can we take that messaging and really shift it to communities in the work that they're already doing? And how can we say that this work that you're doing at this Black church every Sunday with these women is prevention work, right? It may not have a ecological model. It may not, it may not have a program evaluation and outcomes, but the work that they were doing, that grassroots work, is really prevention work. And so that was what resonated for me. Working at the coalition level, again, I always felt a deep sense of privilege to be able to be in those rooms and have those difficult conversations. But as I look back, I realized that there was a missed opportunity, because even though we were talking about intersectionality, and we were comfortable talking about intersectionality through the lens of how it intersects with violence against women. But if we take that concept out of victims of domestic violence or the domestic violence, it really felt like we weren't really having the tough conversations around race and racism, and the impact that oppression has on communities of color, specifically Black communities, as far as the intervention of community violence, sexual violence, state violence. And so I felt like we weren't able to go into that deep place, but I still feel that that work was very groundbreaking and really really helped transform my career as well. So,
Yeah.
Mhm.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I think I wrapped up.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there definitely was not explicit conversations happening at that time in the way that we are talking about them now. I think that I was always shocked, because I was still early in the work, really, at the level of whiteness in these spaces. And, remember leaving meetings because I just felt like, ain't nobody here, like, y'all ain't serious, like, what are we really doing, and staying at other tables because I felt like I had to stay there, right? It's like just this very odd place. Yeah, on the one hand being like, if I'm not here, then nobody's going to raise these issues. But at the same time, I'm here, and if I raise these issues and nobody does anything about it, I'm going to be mad. So there was always that piece too.
Absolutely. I think I felt the same way, always just feeling torn. Like, I really appreciated the opportunity. And again, I even think of the way I'm framing it, like this opportunity that I was given, this opportunity to be in this space with all these other leaders across the nation, mostly white leaders, really feeling like I, from a place of like, wow, I get to be in this space, right? Versus knowing like, no, I deserve to be in this space. My voice is as equally as important in this space. And I had to really find a way to make sure that I owned that, and that I really just embraced that, instead of feeling like I wasn't like deserving to be in the space. And so when I think about just the work that we were doing, and doing it from a lens of being a woman of color and being a Black woman, and through our own lived experiences, I think that was the only way we knew how to do the work. And we understood how important race and racism was, and then how it was operationalized, and how white privilege was really embedded into our work, recognizing there were opportunities from us to benefit from that privilege. But then how do we take that privilege and create opportunities and space for other people? And I think that's one of the things that I did as a leader, because I had the ability to hire folks, right? And I specifically looked for Zoe and recruited Zoe. And it was because I felt a deep sense of responsibility for making sure that I'm also lifting while I climb, right? And that was a huge part of of kind of how I approached the work. And so, that is, I think, really important to share, is that how can we as women of color, especially someone who's working in a mainstream organization, not take on the values of dominant culture? And it can be really difficult to not do that, right? And given your funding sources, the access that you have, the relationships you have with community members, and you have to really be intentional about that. And so I was really proud of the work that we were able to do together in California.
Yeah, and I think that, so you were definitely very like intentional about your hiring, but, and I don't think I've ever probably said this to you out loud, but I think one of the things that I so admired about how you led and how you lead, you always had this like team aspect, which I was like, oh, I wonder if that's because of all the sports that it was just like, it was always a team thing, right? And it was always very intentional. And a lot of the things we did within the Black community, we did outside of the coalition, right? So yeah, we had this privilege. So it was like, okay, let's bring together Black organizations in LA. Let's do that. Let's find out what's happening locally in Sacramento. So I would go and, force my way into events to talk about domestic violence and things like that in the Black community or in churches. So we did a lot of things outside because we realized that there really was only so much that we could do within that coalition structure.
Absolutely. And Levon, I'm so glad that you're here, sister. It's so good to see your name. And that's another example. I mean, I was as an executive director of the coalition, which I didn't start in that place, right? I was mentored and groomed to become the executive director, and I had the support of women of color in the movement. So it made it so much well, they pretty much told me I had no choice to apply, but to apply for the job. Like, that's how I became the executive director of the partnership. When a group of Black women who were my mentors in California had a meeting and basically said, Tara, you're going to apply for this job. And if you don't get it, you're going to develop your exit strategy. And that was the messaging I got from women of color leaders that gave me the courage to actually believe that I can actually not only apply for this job, but if I should be the one to get this job based on the work that I have done within that organization. And so I've always really felt really blessed to be able to have that type of mentoring and support that I know a lot of other women of color don't get when they come into mainstream organizations. And then being able to be in a position of power and make decisions about who gets to be the keynote of your statewide conference. I remember when we brought in Levon, it was amazing, to our statewide conference in Sacramento. I remember when we brought in Call to Men early on,
I think
when the movement was struggling.
I'm just saying.
And so I remember us being in these spaces and really making those moves and taking those risks.
You're doing too much.
And it was just a great thing. And as I think about my journey, given that I still work in a mainstream, I'm the CEO of a YWCA, which comes with a lot of legacy, history in the women's movement, funding, and resources. And when I came into this organization, like most of the domestic violence organizations, we were discussing the intersection between domestic violence and racism. But I really felt like we needed to take a deeper look at the work that we were doing. And so when I came into the organization and I walked into our emergency shelter and I started to look at our policies and our procedures in our organization, they were very dominant culture behavior. And because I was a woman of color in a position of power, I was able to shift those things. I was able to change our curfew from 6 p.m. at the shelter to 11 p.m. You know, make key decisions on like, no, we're not going to lock up every single product that we have. Like, we're going to put these products out for the women and they can take what they need, right? Changing that type of that approach to our work. And so it was really, you know, an amazing opportunity to do really good work that I've learned about the coalition and then bring it to the local level. The other thing I feel like once I started working in a mainstream organization as a woman of color, I also work in a very, in a community that's a very close-knit community that is 2% African American. So I was wondering, like, how can I do this work from a space of a woman of color in a community where Black people only make up 2% of the population? And how can I address issues of systemic racism that doesn't isolate our commitment to domestic violence from our commitment to racial justice? So one of the things that was really inviting to me about working for YWCA is the mission statement of eliminating racism and empowering women. Even though this organization wasn't doing racial justice work at that time, but being an African-American woman and coming into the space, I had to also be very careful. I could not just come in and enter the space talking about Black Lives Matter. For me, one of the strategies for me was really was figuring out, where are people at? Where is the line? And if I can walk to that line and slowly begin to push it so that we can begin to have these conversations about race and racism and how they impact not only our services, but also how it is existing within the system that we're working in. And so I've been really fortunate to be able to move the needle in a very close-knit organization, and really separate the work, recognizing that racial justice work is prevention. It is prevention. Racial justice work is prevention of intimate partner violence. So we have to do the work. We can do it through intersections, but there are times where we actually need to specifically focus on our racial justice work, and do it from a place that centers Black and Brown communities.
Just really.
I hear you, Zoe.
Hi, Tara. Zoe is having trouble hearing our audio, so
Okay.
we're going to get her connected back into the audio.
Okay. So, yeah, sorry about that. I'm trying to find our script here and can be aware of time. Oh, you're back, Zoe.
Yeah.
So I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was just sharing some of the strategies that I have been able to implement as a woman of color, leading a mainstream organization that is in a community that is very close knit, and where less than 2% of the population is African American. And so I think so being able to really begin to have these conversations in the community, but do it in a place of meeting people where they're at, but also continuing to push. And part of the reason why we have to do the work that way is sustainability piece, right? And so after the murder of George Floyd, the community turned to the YWCA. We don't have an ACLU, we don't have an NAACP in our community. And so the community turned to the YWCA because of our mission, right? So even though we had no racial justice work, we weren't at these tables, it became really clear that we needed to get out in front and we needed to make sure we had a statement. And I didn't ask for permission. I just did it, right? I just did it. And I was willing to take whatever risk. If that means my board was uncomfortable, if we were going to lose funding, I was willing to take that risk. And thankfully, the risk really, we benefited from that risk. We did lose people. We lost a lot of people. I was personally attacked by people in this community as my own personal agenda, because again, here I am, a Black woman, and if I'm talking about racial justice work, it has to be my personal agenda. So I was faced with that type of backlash in this community. But I was also embraced by a tremendous amount of allies and the faith community, and we were able to form our Coalition for an Anti-Racist Glendale, which led to the Sundown Town Resolution that was adopted was the first state we were the first city in California, and now 3 other cities in California have also passed Sundown Town resolutions. And so because of that work, we had to also begin to look at our practices internally as an organization. And if we're on the outside, I'm talking to folks about centering Black and Brown people, looking at centering Black women's voices and people's lived experiences. How are we doing that as an organization? And so really trying to make sure that we are doing everything in our power to shift dominant culture behavior. So this idea of, if you don't have a master's degree, you cannot climb the ladder does not exist within the YWCA Glendale, Pasadena. And we know that there are some funders that will say that this is a requirement of funding. And we've been able to navigate those experiences with our funders to make sure that we are giving opportunities to people, women of color and people of color who have lived experiences and have been working in this movement. And so I have a lot of, I'm really grateful that I've took those risks instead of just looking at the grant and saying, well, the grant says no, so therefore you can't have this position. No, I'm going to reach out to the funder. We're going to have a conversation. Does that mean that I have to be listed? If that means I have to be the domestic violence director, then I will be the domestic violence director, but we're going to figure out a way to still uplift people in this organization and not allow those barriers to hold them back. And so that's something that I've been really fortunate enough to do within our organization, and, really lift people up who were frontline workers, shelter advocates, who are now leading our organization, who are now leading our domestic violence education and training, who are now leading our case management work. These are all women of color who started as shelter advocates, and they're still here to this day. And so I'm really proud that, I was able to create that space and really leverage my power and my privilege to create space. And so that's, again, another benefit of working in a mainstream organization, having access to resources, but at the same time, wanting to truly be my authentic self as a Black woman and within this community. And so I've been lucky enough to be able to do that. But I also, again, it always goes back to this place of privilege, right? I still present as a biracial woman, non-threatening woman, until they start talking to me. Then they're probably like, oh man, who did we invite to this meeting? But once they realize my deep commitment to racial justice work, I'm sure they get a little fearful. But nonetheless, I think that those are some of the strategies of how I've been able to navigate the work around racial justice within a mainstream organization. I think the challenge, and what continues to be a challenge, is, of course, having to navigate this work as a woman of color in a mainstream in a mainstream community. But the other challenge is really sustainability. And how do we sustain this work? And that's what we're dealing with right now. Like, we had this momentum, we started this coalition, we have volunteers, but women of color in my organization are the ones having to lead the work. And it's exhausting. And it comes to a place of, how can we sustain this as an organization, but how can we sustain this as women of color leading racial justice work in a community that's less than 2% Black, right? Like, what's going to be the real significant impact and change? And unless others are leading the work besides women of color. So that's kind of one of the challenges, I think, in doing this work in a mainstream organization. How about you, Zoe? Talk with us a little bit about your racial justice work and how you've been able to really create a lane for yourself. I mean, you really created the space to do this work. I think one of the things that I think is most interesting about your journey, Zoe, for me, is that I watched you work in mainstream organizations and non-mainstream organizations. And through that work, you really have created a space to really truly be who you are and show up in your authentic self. And I just think that it's been a beautiful transformation to watch. And so I would love to hear about, how you were navigated the space around racial justice and anti-Blackness.
Yeah, it's been hard. It's been really challenging to stay in this work. I've been like trying to leave it for like 20 years just because of these things. But I carved away kind of because I just had to. I just felt like I was at odds with so many of the organizations that I worked with. I think just because of how I present and my expectations. I expect that we could do this work with joy and fun and laughter, and not from a place of crisis and all of those things. And in the body that I'm in, I feel like, though, I also, like you, I've gotten a lot of support. I really have to sit back. I was thinking about that today, like the ways that I have been supported. A lot of the relationships that I made with the early Deltas, we are still in communication. We still work together. So I have been assisted in this movement as well, and have been harmed a lot. And so I had to create that lane for me, as mainly consulting, because it's just data for me to just to just be a consultant in this work. But as far as the racial equity framework, now a lot of the work I'm doing is with organizations, combing through their policies and procedures with a racialized lens. Going through people's policies, and they talk so much about respect. So then I'm having conversations with them about people can be respectful and be racist. It happens every day, right? And so I love that work. I love going in and really seeing what's happening and doing my best through a healing and wellness process of trying to come to some kind of repair around these issues. It's not always possible because of the ways that things are set up. But that's a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past, really mainly 2 years, really since the racial uprising. Like you, Tara, someone came to me and was like, you need to start doing this work with shelters. You need to start doing racial equity work with shelters. And I was like, no, I talk about domestic violence. I talk about healing. I'm an artist. And they're like, no, you really need to start turning your listening sessions to these DV and sexual assault programs. And so that's a lot of what I'm doing now. I'm branching out of DV and SA. So I'm also working with organizations that work on food and Black farmers and education, and weaving a racial equity lens into my work with them as well. One of the other things that I did most recently is I expanded our social ecological model to the cultural spiritual ecological model, because there are things that are important to me now that I'm paying attention to, like the land. And so strategies around mentoring people around their relationship to the land and reconnection to the land is in that new model. We don't talk explicitly about anti-Blackness, at least in the version of the SEM that I was introduced to. We weren't talking about that. But the model that I created, I really feel like it expands it. And I talk about white supremacy culture explicitly, anti-Blackness explicitly, transphobia explicitly. So I took each one of the levels and, I just flipped them a little bit. So I have a cultural, spiritual, concentric circle. So it's a little different. Casey and they have the model. So hopefully when the materials go out, you all can see it. I'm also looking for feedback on it because it is a new model. But I feel like these are just things, these connections are just connections that we don't make enough, particularly when it comes to the land and, the way that we sort of call Mother Earth, and we kind of treat Mother Earth like we treat women identified people. And so it's like, how can we be doing this anti-violence work and not be connected to the land as well? So that's how I'm weaving those racial equity,
One of the things before we go on, because I want to ask you about your listening sessions, but one thing that you said that I had to take a moment to reflect on is feeling both supported by this movement and also feeling harmed by this movement. And I know I talk a lot about my support, but I also was harmed. And I was quickly reminded that, wait a minute, Tara, you are a woman of color. Once I was in a situation where I was arrested for protecting myself against an abusive partner, it became real apparent that people began to distance themselves from me in this movement. And it was the most heartbreaking experience that I experienced. And I actually walked away from the coalition at that time because of that domestic violence arrest that I had. And it was heartbreaking because I was like, wait, everything we talk about in our work around supporting women of color and understanding that women of color are will most likely be arrested in domestic violence situations. And here I am as a woman of color and a leader that was embraced and loved by this movement. But as soon as that experience happened, I immediately was like, you are Black, Tara. you are a Black woman at the end of the day. And it was really heartbreaking to have to walk away from the work. But I know it was also something that I needed to do for my own healing as well. And the beautiful thing about it is when I was approached about this YWCA position 5 years later, and I was hesitant to throw my hat in the ring because if anybody would Google me, they would find out about my history. And would that prevent me from being able to do work in this space again? And I walked into a boardroom with, for my interview, with nothing but older white women, and I'm thinking there's no way they're going to pick a Black woman to run the YWCA, let alone a Black woman who has a history of domestic violence. And they supported me 100%. And that's how I was able to come back into this work and do this work from that space. And so I just wanted to share that story because I do talk a lot about how I feel supported, but I also was harmed. And it's it's still difficult to talk about and share. But we have to remind ourselves, if we are truly going to be supporting women and women of color, their history and background, whether it's they've been formally arrested, formally incarcerated, we can't allow that to stop us from creating a space for those people to be in this movement. And so I just wanted to share that because I just felt moved to share that with folks. And so thank you for just bringing that up and creating that space for me to share that, Zoe. And that's one of the things that I really love about you and your soul, is that you create safe spaces for people and to share their stories and to feel. And I see all the love coming in, so thank you. But back to your listening sessions, Zoe. I would love, I know, right? You were with me through that journey, so you were a big part of watching my transition, and the fact that I'm here now, sitting in front of all of you, really feels good because I see so many familiar names, and it just feels good to be back in this space and in community with you all. So with that, Zoe, I think we only have like 10 more minutes. I know there may be questions, but again, I think that the listening sessions that you're doing, I want to create space for you to share that, because I think that these are very important. It's very important that we are listening to folks, right? Can you talk a little bit about your listening strategies, your listening sessions, and what you're hearing from people now that we are in this space of talking about racial justice and anti-Blackness and violence against women?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I'm hearing across the country and in the territories, sadly, is that not much has changed since the 20 years that we came into the work. A lot of the same harms that you shared that have happened to me are still happening, and I guess on the flip side, what's the flip side? What's the flip side? I don't know what the flip side is. So yeah, I don't know what the flip side is, but I think what is exciting, I guess, is that I'm being called in to do them, right? That's, I guess, the flip side. So I'm doing a lot of listening sessions with local programs, domestic violence and sexual assault. Probably.
So we can't hear you that much, or your voice went away a little bit.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me make sure that my sound is up. Okay. So when I was with the Women of Color Network, they tasked me with leading the Uber project. And we decided that we wanted to do a series of town halls. And so I was able to do them around the country with folks about the ways that they were being victimized in Uber rideshare service. And so that was really outside of the DV sphere. I was asking them specifically about why they think historically and currently marginalized people are more susceptible to having these crimes enacted upon them. And after the first iteration of listening sessions, we decided we wanted to start to make global connections. So I was able to go to Uber in London and talk with the women of color there about their experiences at Uber, what they thought about the victimization that was happening in the rideshare community. I was able to meet with a Muslim organization that works on female genital mutilation. I was able to go to Canada and meet with tribal elders on reserve about their experiences with the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and really trying to strategize how transportation could actually be helpful to them. And then last year, I had a year-long research project with the students at FAMU and at the University of Florida, really trying to gauge what the university's response to them was during COVID and during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that, while so much has stayed the same, I think that social media has helped a lot to get these messages out. I think that the younger people coming along and constantly like pushing and pushing and pushing is really great. And so I think that if there is, again, just sort of a flip side around it, it's that there are some people coming behind us that are going to take this work even farther, right? That these listening, these reports, these things that I'm producing aren't going to just sit on a shelf, but that there are actually people that are willing to take them on.
Absolutely. And I know one thing that I think is really important, before we end this is really, what's our call to action like for the folks out there today? Like, what would be your call to action for anyone that's out here listening to our conversation today and doing this work in this space?
Yeah, focusing on your own healing first, or in tandem of doing this work. We talk a lot about liberation now, but we are like still showing up, traumatized to work, or we're being traumatized at work, or we are the traumatizer at work. And so it's like we really have to get serious about our healing, because I feel that we can't take people where we haven't gone ourselves. We can give them referrals, we can do all those things, but we really have to like do our work. Like a lot of us, we just need to do our work. So there's that piece, our healing work. and invest in that, right? Racial equity is a part of the work, but our healing is also a part of this work. And trusting Black women. You know, you've already heard what Tara has done for so many people. I was able to stay at the Women of Color Network for like 9-10 years, the longest I've stayed in any organization, because I wasn't afraid of being fired for showing up as myself. I wasn't being surveilled. They made sure we were paid equitably. They supported all of the like my woo-woo ideas and found ways to weave it into the organization, right? And so, yeah, trusting Black women. And if you do your healing work, you'll be able to trust yourself, and then you'll be able to trust Black women and other folks. So that's my call to action. What
I
about
love
you?
it.
What about you?
Yeah. No, I think, it's the similar thing. I think it's that creating that space for healing for yourself, but also for your staff, and really, create, and I just think that anybody who's in a position of power, and has the ability to change things around equity, you just have to do it. There's not you just do it because it's right. Like, if I need to pay my shelter advocates $19 an hour because it's right, right? And we're in California, we're $15 minimum wage. I made a commitment that no one makes less than $19 an hour at my organization, and we will figure out a way to make it happen, right? And so those are the risks you have to take because it's the right thing to do. And so I think just continuing to take risk, to continue to examine the people who are at the front lines and what are their needs. And if you can't make a risk like the risk that I took of moving people within our pay scale, but what are other things that we can begin to offer folks? What space can we provide folks so that they feel supported in this work, and supported as they continue to do this work on the front lines? And so my heart is always with frontline advocates. I do this work always thinking about our frontline workers. And I think we have to center that as well. We have to center the people who are on the front lines, and making sure that as organizational leaders, we are constantly thinking about them in every policy, every decision making. They are at the heart of that work. And so that's would be my call to action. And last, I think, Zoe, how can people find you and support your work? Because I think, I work for a mainstream organization, but you are a consultant, and I want people to, support you in your work. And I want people to know how they can contact you and access you.
Yeah, I'm pretty accessible. I'll put information in the chat. You could definitely buy my books. I do have two. I will put the links in the chat. One is From Ashes to Angels Dust, A Journey Through Womanhood. And that is interviews I did with women of color about their experiences with domestic and sexual violence. You could certainly bring me to your organization for book signings. The second is a book of poetry. But pretty much I am Zoe Flowers everywhere: Facebook, Instagram, and I'll put my information in the chat. How about you?
Awesome. And I just put my email in the chat. And so people can definitely feel free to reach out to me and email me. But I have to remember, Zoe, when I first got this job 6 years ago, Zoe was one of the first people I brought in to do a book reading. And I remember bringing you to little small Glendale with no Black folks that live here. And you just brought in yourself, and you did a whole book reading and book signing. And we had our community showed up for you, and it was so beautiful to see. And I just remember that. So please support Zoe, support her books, purchase her books, hire her as a consultant, and compensate her.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome. And so I don't know if it's 10:29. So I don't know, are we taking questions? Are there questions, Casey, or in our CDV? Or
Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Zoe. We are going to move into some processing. You have just been amazing, but it's not my voice people want to hear right now. So if you are all set, we will pass the floor back to our voice, Lalitha Marshall. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Zoe, for that powerful, powerful session. And at this time, we want to pause, breathe, and reflect as needed on what we just heard. So, everybody, just take the time to take care of yourself as we process what we heard in this session. If you need a moment to breathe, remember that the wellness room is available to you. I will pause here to open space to process what you heard in the session. Please use the next 10 minutes to identify what you feel is the call to action and document at least one concrete action you will take in response to that call.
This is Casey chiming in with a note for my fellow white identified participants. If you're feeling the need to step away right now, I encourage you to resist that urge. Your discomfort or reluctance to engage is a sign that it's time to lean in and do the work. We heard some calls to action from Zoe and Tara. Now's the time to reflect on your commitment to change. We are sharing a link in the chat to a Padlet to facilitate your sharing. Inside, you can view the illustration that Andre Medina lovingly captured. Please feel free to use that illustration as a reminder about what was shared today. We invite you to add your concrete action steps to this Padlet so others can see what you are committed to doing moving forward. You'll see the Padlet on your screen now. To use it, go to the link that Brecken shared in the chat, and you can click on the plus sign in the bottom right corner. At this time, as you consider your action steps, we welcome you to unmute yourself in this space and share your thoughts about today's session. And while you're getting ready to do that, I will ask Brecken, our chat monitor, to lift up some of the comments that were shared in the chat. Brecken?
Absolutely. Thanks, Casey. There was a lot of love in the chat throughout the whole session. Especially a lot of love to you, Tara, while you were sharing your story. Let's see. I want to share that Kim brought Beth Ritchie into this space and shared that, they didn't feel like we could have this conversation without bringing Beth into this space. Just lots and lots of love all throughout, echoing that, yes, racial justice work is prevention work. We can't do this work without centering racial justice. Let's see, I'm still scrolling through, just so much love to both presenters. Oh, and I did want to uplift, there was a moment where Zoe was talking about what is the positive side to the fact that we're still seeing the same problems we always have. And Michelle offered, I think the flip side could be more open public discussions of what's really going on around harm, racial injustice, and inequities in the movement, and not just hidden cubicle conversations. So thank you, Michelle, for that strengths-based perspective. And then, just lots of love, echoing that we need to trust Black women. And if anybody else wants to vocalize any reflections in addition to sharing in the Padlet or the chat, please feel free.
Thank you, Brecken. Yes, please. Who would like to share? I see that Cecile has commented in the chat, this has been a healing experience for me also. So much courage expressed here today. An affirmation that we must have courage and be willing to take risks in our work, especially when in mainstream organizations. Please keep your commitments coming in the Padlet. We'll allow a few more minutes for you to think about your action items and add them either in the Padlet, or feel free to vocalize them in this space or share in the chat.